The missiles that streaked across Ukrainian skies this morning weren't just weapons of modern warfare. They were fulfillment of ancient words spoken by prophets who saw our time with supernatural clarity. While world leaders debate military strategies and economic sanctions, a deeper spiritual battle rages beneath the surface, one that was foretold thousands of years ago in the sacred texts of Scripture. Tonight, we're going to uncover the shocking biblical connections that link Ukraine's current suffering to prophecies that most people have never heard. This isn't about taking political sides or supporting one nation over another. This is about understanding how the Creator of the universe moves through history, using even the darkest moments to fulfill His eternal purposes. What you're about to discover will change how you see every headline, every conflict, and every movement of nations on the world stage. From the ancient lands of Scythia to the modern borders of Ukraine, a prophetic thread runs through time, connecting biblical genealogies to today's geopolitical crisis. The Hebrew prophets didn't just see visions of their own time. They saw our time. They saw this conflict. They saw how ancient bloodlines and forgotten curses would manifest in the 21st century through tanks, missiles, and international sanctions. Deep within the Book of Genesis, we find genealogies that most people skip over as boring lists of names. But these aren't just historical records. They're prophetic blueprints that map out how God's judgment and blessing would follow family lines through thousands of years of history. When Genesis chapter 10 gives us the table of nations, it's not just telling us where people went after the flood. It's showing us how divine destinies would unfold across continents and centuries. By these were the isles of the Gentiles, divided in their lands, everyone after his tongue, after their families, in their nations. Genesis 10:5. This isn't ancient history. This is prophetic programming that determines how nations rise and fall even today. The Hebrew word for nations here is goyim, and it carries implications of divine assignment and spiritual inheritance that transcend political boundaries. Ukraine sits at the crossroads of these ancient bloodlines. The Scythians who once roamed these steppes weren't random nomadic tribes. They were descendants of Japheth through his son Magog, carriers of both blessing and curse that would echo through their lineage for millennia. When Ezekiel received his vision of the great northern invasion, he wasn't seeing abstract spiritual warfare. He was seeing the outworking of generational patterns began in the mists of post-flood history. The current conflict isn't happening by accident in this specific geographic location. Ukraine's position between East and West, between the Islamic world and Christian Europe, between the descendants of different sons of Noah, makes it a focal point for spiritual forces that have been building toward confrontation for centuries. The land itself carries the weight of ancient promises and ancient judgments. Consider how many times this region has been the staging ground for invasions that change world history. From the Mongol hordes to Napoleon's march toward Moscow, from Hitler's Operation Barbarossa to today's modern military movements, something keeps drawing the great powers of the world to shed blood on these particular fields. This isn't geopolitical coincidence. This is prophetic inevitability. The Hebrew concept of generational blessing and cursing doesn't stop with individuals. It extends to peoples, tribes, and nations. I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me, and showing mercy unto thousands of them that love me and keep my commandments. Exodus 25:6. When we trace Ukraine's bloodlines back through history, we find both streams flowing through their national DNA. 2,600 years ago, a Hebrew prophet in Babylonian exile received one of the most detailed and terrifying visions ever recorded in Scripture. Ezekiel chapter 38 opens words that should make every person watching today's news headlines pay careful attention. And the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, set thy face against Gog, the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him. Ezekiel 38, 1-2. Most Bible scholars have spent centuries trying to figure out exactly which modern nations these ancient names represent. Tonight, we're going to connect the dots in ways that will astonish you. Magog, according to Genesis chapter 10, was one of the sons of Japheth who settled in the far northern regions after the flood. Ancient historians like Josephus identified Magog's descendants with the Scythians, who inhabited the very region we now call Ukraine and southern Russia. But Ezekiel's vision gets much more specific. He describes this future invasion force with geographic and tactical details that couldn't have been imagination. After many days thou shalt be visited, in the latter years thou shalt come into the land that is brought back from the sword, and is gathered out of many people, against the mountains of Israel, which have been always waste, but it is brought forth out of the nations, and they shall dwell safely, all of them. Ezekiel 38:8. The phrase latter years in Hebrew is Acharith Hayamim, literally meaning the end of days or the final period of human history. Ezekiel wasn't seeing something that would happen in his lifetime or even in ancient times. He was seeing our time, the generation that would witness the regathering of Israel and the final conflicts before Messiah's kingdom. Notice how the prophecy describes an invasion coming against a land brought back from the sword and gathered out of many people. This perfectly describes modern Israel, established in 1948 after nearly 2,000 years of diaspora. The timing isn't coincidental. The current Ukrainian crisis is happening precisely during the generation that has witnessed Israel's prophetic restoration. The Hebrew word for chief prince in this passage is Nasi Rosh, which has led many scholars to connect this prophecy directly with Russia. The ancient name Rosh appears to be the linguistic ancestor of the modern name Russia. When Ezekiel describes the invasion force coming from the uttermost parts of the north using the Hebrew phrase Yakitzaphan, as pointing to the far northern regions that we now identify with modern Russia and Ukraine. But here's where it gets truly extraordinary. Ezekiel describes this invasion force being destroyed by divine intervention, not by human military might. And I will plead against him with pestilence and with blood, and I will rain upon him, and upon his bands, and upon the many people that are with him, an overflowing rain and great hailstones, fire and brimstone. Ezekiel 38:22. The current conflict may be preparing the stage for this ultimate divine judgment. While Ezekiel was seeing invasions from the north, another Hebrew prophet was receiving visions that connected to the same time period from a different angle. Daniel's night visions in chapter 7 revealed a sequence of world empires that would culminate in a fine kingdom unlike anything history had ever seen. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, dreadful and terrible, and strong exceedingly. and it had great iron teeth. Daniel 7:7. This fourth beast represents the final form of gentle world power that will dominate the earth just before God's kingdom is established. Most prophecy students recognize this as a revived form of the Roman Empire. But what they often miss is how the current Ukrainian conflict is helping to reshape the global power structure in ways to align perfectly with Daniel's vision. The European Union and NATO expansion, and the complex web of alliances forming around the Ukrainian crisis are creating exactly the kind of international coalition that Daniel described. And the 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise, and another shall rise after them, and he shall be diverse from the first, and he shall subdue 3 kings. Daniel 7:24. We're watching the consolidation of power that will eventually produce the final world leader. Ukraine's position as a buffer state between competing empires makes it a crucial piece in this prophetic puzzle. The nation's struggle for independence and identity mirrors the birth pangs that Jesus described as signs of the end times. And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. Matthew 24:6-7. The Hebrew word for nation in this passage is ethnos, which means people groups or ethnic divisions. The current conflict in Ukraine involves precisely this kind of ethnic and cultural division, with Russian-speaking populations in the east aligned with Moscow, while Ukrainian speakers in the west look toward Europe and America. This internal division reflects the larger spiritual battle between competing worldviews and spiritual kingdoms. Daniel's vision also revealed the ultimate destiny of these competing powers. But the judgment shall sit, and they shall take away his dominion, to consume and to destroy it unto the end. And the kingdom and dominion, and the greatness of the kingdom under the whole heaven, shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High. Daniel 7:26-27. Every earthly conflict, including Ukraine's current suffering, is moving history toward this final resolution. The prophet saw that human governments would ultimately fail to bring peace and justice. Only the direct intervention of heaven would establish lasting peace. This doesn't mean we shouldn't care about human suffering or pray for justice. It means we should understand current events within the larger framework of God's eternal purposes. Most people have never heard of the Scythians, but these ancient nomadic peoples hold the key to understanding Ukraine's role in biblical prophecy. For over 1,000 years, from roughly 700 BC to 300 AD, Scythian tribes controlled the vast steppes that stretch from modern-day Ukraine through southern Russia and into Central Asia. They weren't just random barbarians. They were a sophisticated civilization with complex religious beliefs and military capabilities that dominated their region for centuries. Ancient historians like Herodotus wrote extensively about Scythian culture and military prowess. They were master horsemen and archers who developed tactics that would influence warfare for centuries. More importantly for our prophetic study, they occupied precisely the geographic regions the biblical prophets identified with the end times invasion of Israel. The connection becomes even more fascinating when we examine Scythian religious beliefs and practices. Archaeological evidence suggests they practiced forms of shamanism and sky worship that directly paralleled the spiritual darkness that the Hebrew prophets warned would characterize the end times invasion force. And I will turn thee back, and put hooks into their jaws, and I will bring thee forth, and all thine army. Ezekiel 38:4. The metaphor of hooks in jaws suggests that this invasion force won't be acting entirely of its own free will. There will be spiritual compulsion, supernatural influence that draws them southward toward Israel like animals, being led by divine constraint. The shamanic traditions of the ancient Scythians opened doorways to precisely the kind of spiritual influence that would make such compulsion possible. Modern Ukraine encompasses much of the historical Scythian heartland. The genetic and cultural legacy of these ancient peoples flows through Ukrainian bloodlines, carrying both the natural military capabilities and the spiritual vulnerabilities that Ezekiel's prophecy requires. This isn't about condemning Ukrainian people or suggesting they're inherently evil. It's about understanding how God uses even difficult genealogical inheritances to fulfill his prophetic purposes. The Scythians were also known for their fierce independence and resistance to foreign domination. Sound familiar? Ukraine's current struggle against Russian influence mirrors the historical Scythian resistance to Persian, Greek, and Roman attempts at conquest. The same spirit of independence that made the ancient Scythians formidable opponents makes modern Ukrainians willing to fight against overwhelming odds. But there's another layer to this connection that most people miss. The Apostle Paul specifically mentions Scythians when describing the universal scope of the gospel, where there is neither Greek nor Jew, circumcision nor uncircumcision, barbarian, Scythian, bond nor free, but Christ is all, and in all. Colossians 3:11. This suggests that God has always had redemptive purposes for the descendants of these ancient peoples. Genesis chapter 10 gives us another crucial piece of this prophetic puzzle through the genealogy of Gomer, another son of Japheth who became the ancestor of peoples who would play major roles in end times events. The sons of Gomer, Ashkenaz and Riphath, and Togarmah. Genesis 10:3. These names aren't just ancient history. They represent bloodlines that would carry both blessing and conflict through thousands of years. Ancient historians and Jewish sources identify Gomer's descendants with the Cimmerians and other peoples who settled in the regions we now call Turkey, Armenia and parts of Eastern Europe. Togarmah specifically became associated with the peoples who would later be known as Armenians and various Caucasian tribes. They of the house of Togarmah traded in the fairs horses and horsemen and mules, Ezekiel 27:14. But it's the connection with Ashkenaz that becomes particularly relevant to understanding Ukraine's role in biblical prophecy. Medieval Jewish sources identified Ashkenaz with Germanic peoples and later with the regions of Eastern Europe, where Ashkenazi Jewish communities flourished for centuries. Ukraine was home to some of the largest and most influential Jewish communities in the world before the 20th century's devastating wars and persecution. The current conflict in Ukraine is playing out in lands where Jewish blood was spilled in unprecedented quantities during the Holocaust and earlier pogroms. This isn't coincidental from a prophetic perspective. The Hebrew prophets consistently linked the treatment of Jewish people with divine blessing and cursing upon nations. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. Genesis 12:3. Ukraine's complex history with its Jewish population carries both tremendous guilt and tremendous opportunity for redemption. The current suffering of Ukrainian people may be connected to generational consequences from past treatment of God's chosen people. but it also creates opportunities for repentance and restoration that could bring unprecedented blessing. The Hebrew concept of tikkun olam, repairing the world, suggests that God uses even tragic circumstances to create opportunities for justice and healing. Ukraine's current crisis has generated an outpouring of international support and humanitarian aid that demonstrates the human capacity for compassion even in dark times. This reflects the image of God in human nature that survives even after the fall. When we understand Ukraine's genealogical connections through Gomer's lineage, we see how ancient family patterns continue to influence modern conflicts. But we also see hope for redemption and restoration that transcends purely political or military solutions. Ezekiel's prophecy becomes even more specific when it identifies Meshech and Tubal as key components of the end times invasion force. Son of man, set thy face against Gog, the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophecy against him Ezekiel 38:2. These aren't obscure ancient tribes that disappeared into history. They represent peoples whose descendants continue to play crucial roles in today's geopolitical landscape. Ancient sources consistently identify Meshech and Tubal with peoples who settled in what we now call the Caucasus region and parts of modern-day Turkey and Russia. The Hebrew pronunciation of Meshech sounds remarkably similar to Moscow, while Tubal appears connected to the Tiberni mentioned in ancient Assyrian records and later classical sources. These linguistic connections aren't mere coincidence when we consider how Hebrew prophets often used wordplay and sound connections to convey deeper meanings. Archaeological evidence supports these connections through cultural artifacts and migration patterns that trace from the ancient Near East into the regions that these peoples eventually inhabited. The metalworking skills that made Tubal famous in ancient times. Javan, Tubal, and Meshech. They were thy merchants. They traded the persons of men and vessels of brass in thy market, Ezekiel 27:30. Continued to characterize these regions through centuries of development. The current conflict in Ukraine sits at the intersection of all these ancient genealogical streams. Russian military forces represent the modern expression of Meshech's descendants, while various allied forces and mercenary groups from the Caucasus region carry the bloodlines of Tubal. The spiritual significance of this convergence cannot be overstated from a prophetic perspective. But here's what makes this even more remarkable. Ezekiel describes the ultimate destruction of this invasion force through direct divine intervention, not human military victory. And I will call for a sword against him throughout all my mountains, saith the Lord God. Every man's sword shall be against his brother, Ezekiel 38:21. This suggests internal conflict and supernatural confusion that would destroy the invasion force from within. The current military challenges facing Russian forces in Ukraine may be early manifestations of this prophetic pattern. Equipment failures, communication problems, logistical nightmares, and tactical confusion have played what should have been a straightforward military operation. From a purely secular perspective, these problems could be attributed to various military and political factors. From a prophetic perspective, they may represent the beginning of divine intervention against the forces that Ezekiel saw in vision. The Hebrew word for sword in this passage is cherub, which can represent not just physical weapons, but any instrument of divine judgment. Economic sanctions, international isolation, internal political pressures, and technological failures could all function as modern expressions of the sword that God calls against this invasion force. Ezekiel's vision of the end times invasion includes a detail that should make every student of current events pay careful attention. Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya with them, all of them with shield and helmet. Ezekiel 38:5. Written during the Babylonian exile, when Persia was still a rising power. This prophecy specifically names the ancient kingdom that we now call Iran as a key ally in the northern invasion force. Today's headlines are filled with evidence of growing military cooperation between Russia and Iran. From weapons transfers to joint military exercises, from shared intelligence operations to coordinated diplomatic initiatives, we're watching the formation of exactly the kind of alliance that Ezekiel predicted 26 centuries ago. This isn't political analysis. This is prophetic fulfillment happening before our eyes. The Hebrew word for Persia is paras, which appears throughout the Old Testament as a major Gentile power that would play crucial roles in God's dealings with Israel. From Cyrus the Great's decree that allowed the Jewish exiles to return and rebuild the temple, to the events recorded in the books of Esther and Daniel, Persia has always been a nation whose relationship with Israel carries profound prophetic significance. Modern Iran's current leadership has repeatedly called for Israel's destruction and has sponsored terrorist organizations dedicated to that goal. This represents a complete reversal from the historical Persian support for Jewish restoration under Cyrus. The transformation of Persia from Israel's benefactor to Israel's enemy represents one of the most dramatic prophetic developments of our time. The weapons systems that Iran is providing to Russian forces in Ukraine aren't just military hardware. They're instruments that are being tested and refined for future use against Israel. The drones, missiles, and electronic warfare capabilities being deployed in Ukrainian battlefields are being evaluated and improved for the ultimate conflict that Ezekiel prophesied. Ukrainian resistance to this alliance serves a prophetic purpose beyond what anyone realizes. Every successful defense against Iranian-supplied weapons, every tactical lesson learned from confronting Persian military technology, potentially contributes to Israel's future ability to defend against the invasion that Ezekiel foresaw. The timing of this alliance formation coincides precisely with other prophetic developments, including Israel's restoration, the rebirth of Hebrew as a living language, Jerusalem's return to Jewish control, and the increasing isolation of Israel in international forums. These convergent trends suggest we're living in the generation that will witness the fulfillment of Ezekiel's most dramatic prophecies. The land of Ukraine itself carries biblical significance that most people never recognize. Ancient trade routes that connected the civilizations of the Near East with northern Europe passed directly through the regions that modern Ukraine encompasses. These weren't just commercial pathways. They were corridors through which biblical peoples migrated, religious ideas spread, and prophetic destinies unfolded. The Dnieper River that flows through the heart of Ukraine was known to ancient geographers as one of the great rivers of Scythia. Rivers in biblical symbolism often represent peoples, nations, and spiritual movements. The waters which thou sawest, where the horse sitteth, are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. Revelation 17:15. The current conflict is literally playing out along riverine corridors that have carried both blessing and cursing through millennia. Archaeological discoveries throughout Ukraine have uncovered evidence of ancient civilizations that practiced religious rituals remarkably similar to those described in the Old Testament. Burial mounds, sacrificial sites, and religious artifacts suggest that this region was a meeting point between various spiritual traditions, including some that may have preserved echoes of pre-free flood religious knowledge. The ancient city of Kiev itself sits at a geographic crossroads that has made it strategically important throughout history. From Viking trade routes to Mongol invasion paths, from medieval crusades to modern military campaigns, something about this location keeps drawing world historical movements to converge here. This geographic destiny wasn't an accident from a biblical perspective. The Hebrew concept of Eretz, meaning land or earth, carries implications of spiritual as well as physical territory. Certain regions carry spiritual atmospheres that influence the people who inhabit them across generations. Ukraine's position between Christian and Islamic civilizations, between Catholic and Orthodox Christianity, between European and Asian cultural influences, creates a spiritual complexity that affects everything that happens there. The current conflict is being fought over territory that has witnessed every major migration, invasion, and cultural transformation that has shaped European history. The spiritual residue of these events creates an atmosphere where ancient grudges, generational conflicts, and prophetic destinies converge with unusual intensity. Understanding Ukraine's biblical geography helps explain why this particular conflict has captured global attention in ways that other regional wars have not. There's something about this land that resonates with deeper spiritual realities that affect all of humanity, whether we recognize it consciously or not. While Old Testament prophets like Ezekiel and Daniel provided crucial pieces of the end times puzzle, the Book of Revelation gives us the most detailed timeline of how these ancient prophecies will ultimately unfold. And I heard a voice from the four horns of the golden altar, which is before God, saying to the sixth angel which had the trumpet, "Loose the four angels which are bound in the great river Euphrates." And the four angels were loosed, which were prepared for an hour, and a day, and a month, and a year, for to slay the third part of men. Revelation 9:13-15. This passage describes supernatural forces being released that will precipitate conflicts on an unprecedented scale. The timing mechanism described here, an hour and a day and a month and a year, represents divine precision in prophetic fulfillment. Current events aren't happening randomly or according to purely human political calculations. There's a supernatural schedule that's being followed with mathematical precision, and Ukraine's crisis appears to be synchronized with this heavenly timeline. The massive military casualties that would result from the conflicts described in Revelation require weapons, systems, and tactical approaches that are being developed and tested in the current Ukrainian theater of operations. Drone swarms, electronic warfare capabilities, cyber attacks on civilian infrastructure, and precision strike technologies are all being refined through actual combat experience that will inform future conflicts of much larger scale. John's vision also describes economic disruption on a global scale that would accompany these end-times conflicts. And no man might buy or sell, save he that had the mark, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name. Revelation 13. The economic sanctions and supply chain disruptions resulting from the Ukrainian crisis are creating exactly the kind of financial instability that could justify an incomprehensive economic control system that Revelation, the Trostifik Complement Creation, describes. The transformation of warfare itself through artificial intelligence, autonomous weapons systems, and integrated global surveillance networks creates the technological infrastructure that would be necessary to implement the kind of comprehensive control over human behavior biblical prophecy predicts for the end times. Perhaps most significantly, the current crisis is accelerating the formation of the kind of global coalition that Revelation describes as the final opposition to God's kingdom on earth. And he gathered them together into a place called in the Hebrew tongue Armageddon, Revelation 16:16. While this ultimate battle will be fought in Israel, the alliances and enmities being formed through the Ukrainian conflict are shaping the political landscape that will make that final confrontation possible. The Hebrew concept of generational blessing and cursing provides a crucial framework for understanding why Ukraine's current suffering may be connected to spiritual realities that transcend purely political or military explanations. Beware that thou forget not the Lord the God, in not keeping his commandments, and his judgments, and his statutes, which I command thee this day, lest when thou hast eaten and art full, and hast built goodly houses, and dwelt therein. Deuteronomy 8:11-12. The principle of divine blessing following obedience and cursing following disobedience operates not just for individuals, but for entire peoples and nations. Ukraine's history includes both tremendous spiritual heritage and tragic moral failures that created the kind of generational consequences that the Hebrew prophets consistently warned about. The region was home to thriving Christian communities for over 1,000 years, producing saints, scholars, and spiritual leaders who contributed to the global church's development. But the same lands has also witnessed some of history's most horrific persecutions of Jewish people, from medieval pogroms to the systematic extermination attempts of the 20th century. The Hebrew prophets made clear that how nations treat Jewish people directly affects their own destiny. For he that toucheth you toucheth the apple of his eye, Zechariah 2:8. The current suffering of Ukrainian people may represent the outworking of generational consequences from these historical injustices, but it also creates unprecedented opportunities for repentance and restoration. The Hebrew word for repentance is teshuvah, which literally means turning around or returning. It implies not just feeling sorry for past mistakes, but actively changing direction and making restitution where possible. Ukraine's current crisis has generated exactly this kind of national soul-searching and spiritual awakening in ways that decades of prosperity never could have accomplished. International support for Ukraine has also created opportunities for the global church to demonstrate the kind of practical compassion that validates the gospel message. Humanitarian aid, refugee assistance, and intercession for peace represent modern expressions of the Good Samaritan principle that Jesus taught as essential to authentic faith. The same spiritual principles that can bring cursing can also bring unprecedented blessing when properly applied. Ukraine's geographical position and cultural heritage could make it a launching point for spiritual revival that spreads throughout Eastern Europe and beyond, if current suffering leads to genuine repentance and spiritual renewal. Perhaps the most significant prophetic aspect Ukraine's current crisis is its connection to God's end-times plan for Israel and the Jewish people. Every major prophetic passage about end-times events eventually leads back to Israel as the focal point of God's ultimate purposes for human history. President Zelensky's Jewish heritage isn't coincidental from a biblical prophetic perspective. Throughout history, God has often used people of Jewish background to play crucial roles in events that affect both Jewish and Gentile destiny. From Esther saving the Persian Jewish community to various Jewish leaders influencing Gentile rulers at crucial historical moments, this pattern continues in our time. The fact that a Jewish leader is currently defending European territory against invasion from the north creates prophetic parallels that are too significant to ignore. Ezekiel's prophecy of the northern invasion specifically targets Israel, but the current conflict may be serving as a preview or preparation for that ultimate confrontation. Israel's response to Ukraine's crisis has been carefully calibrated to avoid antagonizing Russia while still providing humanitarian assistance. This delicate diplomatic balance reflects Israel's awareness that their nation's ultimate survival may depend on not creating unnecessary enemies before the prophesied time of unprecedented crisis arrives. The weapons systems and defensive strategies being developed through Ukraine's resistance to invasion will inevitably influence Israel's preparation for the conflicts that biblical prophecy predicts. Every tactical lesson learned, every technological advancement tested, every diplomatic relationship forged through this crisis potentially contributes to Israel's future defensive capabilities. The timing of Ukraine's crisis, during the generation that has witnessed Israel's restoration to their ancient homeland, creates prophetic significance that extends far beyond regional politics. We're watching the setup phase for conflicts that will ultimately determine whether human governments or divine kingdom will control the future of our planet. The Hebrew prophets consistently taught that Israel's destiny and Gentile destiny are intertwined. Thus saith the Lord, which giveth the sun for a light by day, and the ordinances of the moon, and of the stars for a light by night, which divideth the sea when the waves thereof roar. The Lord of hosts is his name, if those ordinances depart from before me, saith the Lord. Then the seed of Israel also shall cease from being a nation before me forever. Jeremiah 31:35-36. Ukraine's crisis is helping to reshape global alliances and international law in ways that will affect how the world responds when Israel faces its ultimate time of trouble. The precedents being established for international intervention, refugee assistance, and economic sanctions will influence how the international community responds to future Middle Eastern conflicts. One of the most remarkable aspects of Ezekiel's prophecy about the northern invasion is its description of divine timing that operates independently of human political or military calculations. After many days thou shalt be visited, in the latter years thou shalt come into the land that is brought back from the sword. Ezekiel 38:8. This suggests supernatural scheduling that transcends human planning. The Hebrew phrase translated after many days is yemim rabim, which implies an extended period of preparation and development. The current Ukrainian crisis appears to be part of this extended preparation period, during which the alliances, weapons systems, and political conditions necessary for the ultimate fulfillment of Ezekiel's prophecy are being established. The concept of divine timing in biblical prophecy operates according to principles that most people never consider. God's timetable isn't determined by human convenience or political expedience. It's determined by spiritual conditions, generational cycles, and cosmic purposes that operate on scales much larger than individual human lifespans. The current conflict is teaching military strategists, weapons designers, and political leaders lessons that will inform their decisions during future conflicts of much larger scale. Every tactical innovation, every diplomatic failure, Every economic disruption serves an educational purpose that prepares the participants for the ultimate confrontations that biblical prophecy describes. The Hebrew calendar system provides additional insights into divine timing that most Western observers miss. The current period corresponds to Hebrew years that carry prophetic significance related to Jubilee cycles, sabbatical years, and other biblical timing mechanisms that affect when God releases major historical developments. The convergence of multiple prophetic timing indicators suggests we're living in a season when divine intervention in human history is more likely than in ordinary periods. The current Ukrainian crisis may be serving as a catalyst that accelerates other prophetic developments that have been building toward climax for decades. Understanding divine timing helps explain why diplomatic solutions to the Ukrainian crisis have been so elusive despite the obvious benefits that peace would bring to all parties involved. There may be spiritual purposes being served through the continuation of conflict that transcend purely human political considerations. The biblical pattern shows that God often allows circumstances to develop to crisis points before implementing supernatural solutions. The current escalation of global tensions may be necessary preparation for the kind of divine intervention that Ezekiel prophesied would ultimately resolve these counter-natural means rather than human negotiations through supernegotiation. While political leaders debate military strategies and economic policies, the global church has a unique prophetic role to play during this season of crisis. The Apostle Paul made clear that believers have access to spiritual weapons that are more powerful than conventional military might. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds, 2 Corinthians 10:4. The current Ukrainian crisis has generated an unprecedented global prayer movement that transcends denominational boundaries and national loyalties. Christians around the world are interceding for peace, praying for protection of innocent civilians, and asking God to work through these tragic circumstances to accomplish His ultimate purposes. This prayer movement may be serving prophetic functions that go far beyond what the participants realize. Biblical history demonstrates that divine intervention in international conflicts often can respond to the intercession of God's people. From Abraham's intercession for Sodom to Daniel's intercession for Israel's restoration, prayer has consistently influenced the timing and nature of God's historical interventions. And I sought for a man among them that should make up the hedge and stand in the gap before me for the land, that I should not destroy it, but I found none. Ezekiel 22:30. The global church response to Ukrainian refugees has demonstrated practical compassion that validates the gospel message in ways that purely theological arguments never could. When people see Christians sacrificing their comfort and resources to help strangers in need, it creates credibility for the spiritual message that the church proclaims. This humanitarian response also serves prophetic purposes by establishing networks of relationship and cooperation that may become crucial during future crises. The organizational systems, communication networks, and logistical capabilities being developed to assist Ukrainian refugees could be used to help Jewish refugees if and when the persecution that biblical prophecy predicts for the end times begins to unfold. The church's role during this crisis extends beyond humanitarian assistance to prophetic interpretation that helps people understand current events within the framework of God's eternal purposes. Rather than simply taking political sides or promoting particular policy positions, The church can help people see the spiritual significance of what's happening and respond with faith rather than fear. Biblical prophecy consistently teaches that the darkest periods of human history are often preludes to the greatest demonstrations of divine power and love. The current crisis, tragic as it is for those directly affected, may be preparing the way for spiritual breakthroughs that will benefit all humanity. The economic disruptions caused by the Ukrainian conflict represent more than temporary market adjustments. They appear to be beginning of the kind of global financial transformation that biblical prophecy predicts will characterize the end times. And he causeth all both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand, or in their foreheads, and that no man might buy or sell, save he that had the mark. Revelation 13:16-17. The weaponization of international banking systems, the exclusion of entire nations from global payment networks, and the increasing government control over digital currencies are creating exactly the kind of comprehensive financial control mechanisms that Revelation describes. The disruption of agricultural exports from Ukraine and Russia has created food shortages and price increases that affect populations around the world. These aren't just temporary supply chain problems. They represent the kind of global scarcity that could justify implementing the kind of rationing and resource allocation systems that would require comprehensive tracking of individual economic activity. The Hebrew concept of economic justice, mishpat, implies that God has standards for how financial systems should operate and will ultimately judge nations based on their economic policies. The current crisis is revealing the extent to which global financial systems have become divorced from biblical principles of fairness, honesty, and care for the vulnerable. The acceleration of digital payment systems and the decline of cash transactions creates the technological infrastructure that would be necessary to implement the kind of economic control that biblical prophecy describes. The current crisis has also exposed the vulnerability of global supply chains to geopolitical disruption. This vulnerability could justify the development of more centralized control systems that would be necessary to maintain economic stability during future crises of even larger magnitude. The Hebrew prophets consistently warned that economic systems based on injustice and exploitation would ultimately collapse and be replaced by divine alternatives. But thou shalt remember the Lord thy God, for it is he that giveth thee power to get wealth, that he may establish his covenant, which he sware unto thy fathers, as it is this day. Deuteronomy 8:18. The economic transformation that appears to be beginning through the Ukrainian crisis may ultimately serve God's purposes by creating conditions that humanity mortal chave to the kind of fundable kingdom govern that his kingdom will bring to receptage lose commerce. Throughout the current Ukrainian crisis, careful observers have noted unusual natural phenomena that may carry prophetic significance beyond what most people recognize. Biblical prophecy consistently links supernatural intervention with unusual signs in the natural world. And I will shew wonders in heaven above, and signs in the earth beneath, blood and fire, and vapor of smoke. Acts 2:19. Unusual weather patterns, agricultural disruptions, and even geological events in the region may be serving as natural signs that accompany the spiritual warfare being played out through military conflict. The electromagnetic effects of modern warfare systems create atmospheric disturbances that can affect weather patterns, radio communications, and even animal behavior in ways that previous generations of warriors never experienced. These technological impacts on natural systems create new forms of the signs and wonders that biblical prophecy associates with end times events. The disruption of normal agricultural cycles through warfare creates exactly the kind of famine conditions that biblical prophecy describes as characteristic of the end times. And there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in divers places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. Matthew 24:7-8. The psychological impact of constant threat and uncertainty creates the kind of widespread fear and anxiety that Jesus specifically prophesied would characterize the generation that witnesses the end times. Men's hearts failing them for fear and for looking after those things which are coming on the earth, for the powers of heaven shall be shaken. Luke 21:26. The acceleration of communication technology allows news of disasters and conflicts to spread instantaneously around the globe, creating the kind of global awareness of simultaneous crises that previous generations never experienced. This technological capability makes possible the fulfillment of prophecies that require global knowledge events happening in specific locations. The Hebrew concept of Olam Hazeh, this present world system, implies that natural and spiritual realities are interconnected in ways that most people don't understand. Military conflicts aren't just political or economic phenomena. They represent spiritual battles being fought in both heavenly and earthly realms simultaneously. Understanding the supernatural dimensions of current events helps explain why purely human solutions to complex international problems often fail, despite the obvious benefits that peaceful resolution would bring to all various entities involved. As we watch today's headlines unfold, we're witnessing the convergence of prophetic streams that have been building toward climax for thousands of years. The genealogical lines traced through Genesis, the invasion routes mapped by Ezekiel, the governmental systems described by Daniel, and the final conflicts revealed in Revelation are all intersecting in ways that should astonish anyone who takes biblical prophecy seriously. Ukraine's position at the center of these converging prophetic streams isn't accidental. This nation sits at the geographic crossroads where ancient bloodlines meet, where competing empires clash, where spiritual atmospheres collide. The current conflict represents far more than a regional dispute over territory or political influence. The weapons being tested, the alliances being formed, the economic systems being transformed, and the psychological conditions being created through this crisis are preparing the stage for conflicts that will ultimately determine the future of human civilization. Every tactical lesson learned, every diplomatic precedent established, every technological breakthrough achieved serves educational purposes that extend far beyond the current participants. The timing of these developments during the generation that has witnessed Israel's restoration, Jerusalem's reunification under Jewish control, and the revival of Hebrew as a living language creates prophetic significance that transcends coincidence. We're living in the season that the Hebrew prophets identified as the time when ancient promises and ancient warnings would reach their ultimate fulfillment. The global church response to this crisis reveals both the potential and the limitations of human compassion. Humanitarian aid and intercession demonstrate the reality of God's love working through human instruments, but they also highlight the need for supernatural intervention that transcends purely human solutions to humanity's deepest problems. The acceleration of prophetic fulfillment that we're witnessing through current events suggests that the generation alive today may be the one that witnesses the return of Messiah and the establishment of God's kingdom on earth. This possibility should affect how we view every headline, every political development, every economic trend, and every social transformation that we observe. The Hebrew concept of tikkun olam, repairing the world, reminds us that even the darkest events can serve redemptive purposes when understood within God's eternal plan. Ukraine's current suffering, tragic as it is for those directly affected, may be serving purposes that will ultimately benefit all humanity through the prophetic developments it makes possible. Rather than responding to these events with fear or despair, those who understand biblical prophecy can respond with confident faith in God's ultimate victory over all forces that oppose his purposes. The same scriptures that predict unprecedented crisis also promise unprecedented divine intervention that will establish justice, peace, and righteousness throughout the earth. Tell us in the comments how you see these prophetic connections playing out in today's headlines. Share this revelation with someone who needs to understand the deeper spiritual significance of current events. And remember that even in the darkest times, our God remains sovereign over all nations, all conflicts, and all human history. The final victory belongs to him, and that victory is closer than most people realize.